Okay, we're getting quite a lot of questions in now, so I'm just gonna go through them. Dan, I suppose this one is for Sheldon. What is the connection between racism and sexuation?
Wow, what a simple question. So I wrote an entire chapter on that, and I'm sure I can't do justice to it. But I would say basically, sexuation cannot be collapsed uh, um, with race, but sexuation is about how you learn to enjoy after you have confronted lack. It's about modes of enjoyment, and Lacan puts together a chart, the graph of sexuation, in which he explains different ways that we access jouissance or enjoyment once we've confronted lack. And my assertion is basically that race allows us access to each of those modes of enjoyment that Lacan outlines. And so, sex for Lacan is in the real, it's outside of the symbolic, but race is within the symbolic, but yet still impacts what happens in the real. Right. So race becomes a way of sort of mediating the lack that we are confronted with. I know that's abstract, but that's why you have to buy the book.
And I suppose, Derek, do you agree?
Do I agree with Sheldon? No way, of course not. No, yeah, I'm just being silly. I think it's a really important argument. And again, maybe not to try to get into the details of what can often be quite complex theory, but I think just to say one of the things that Sheldon's chapter really does is it foregrounds for us. You could say that in a first era of Lacanian psychoanalytic scholarship in respect of race, like Kalpana's book, Desiring Whiteness, it's a lot of it is about signifiers, about the symbolic, about the engendering of whiteness, so on and so forth. But what I think Sheldon's chapter does, and some of the chapters in the book do, is to say, well, that's useful work, but what's a kind of the next step in Lacanian theorizations of race and racism should be endeavoring to do, is to think about how jouissance is domesticated, how fantasy, how drive, libido, these concepts are also, and of course, the big one really is the notion of the real, how these should also inform how we're going to go about thinking about race. So, I mean, I could say more about that, but let's see if there's some questions. But just before I do that, I think I would also just say that Galton Basu Thacker's chapter is right towards the end of the book, maybe the last chapter, I forget, or the second last chapter. But he does this thing where he says, well, of all of these Lacanian concepts, from enjoyment, the imaginary, the big other, all of them are productive when we're thinking about race. But how do we start to think race in terms of the real? And one of the things that he does is he offers us an interesting conjunction. Could we think of Blackness, not Blackness as everyday, whatever racial identity, but Blackness as produced in conditions of anti-Blackness as a real of sorts? And I think for me, that really starts to push forward the remit of Lacanian psychoanalysis in respect of race and racism. And just one last thing there, another very interesting and I think productive analytical strategy is to take Frantz Fanon's notion of the zone of non-being, and particularly that emphasis on non-being. And the idea here, of course, is that in white supremacist societies, colonial racism, and for that matter, contemporary forms of racism, Blackness is often consigned to this non-being, a status of non-being, and Afro-pessimism will make the same remarks. And one of the things that Galton does is to ask us the question, how does that notion of non-being align with, or have some friction with, or connect to the Lacanian notion of the real, for a start, and also to think about how those notions of non-being might have some connection, or again, some friction with the Lacanian notion of the subject as lacking. So I won't go on too far, but just to say that, you know, to me, these seem to be kind of breakthrough points, important moments in how Lacanians might think about, and psychoanalysts might think about race and contemporary formations of race and racism.
And I think this leads on quite nicely to a question from Neil, who says, Sheldon mentioned the relation between race and the Lacanian idea of the subject. How could one conceptualize the subject as a subject that is also structured by race?
So, you know, Lacan talks about subjectivity as structured by a question. The question is, what am I there? He says this is a question that every subject confronts. What am I there? And the there at the end of the subject, at the end of that question, relates to sort of positionality within the symbolic. Sort of where am I? How do I position myself? But it's also a question about what am I? And traditionally, Lacanian psychoanalysis has tried to answer that question. Lacan himself has tried to answer that question through answers that focus on sex and being. So for Lacan, it's a question about, you know, it's the question that the hysteric acts as of herself and of the other. What am I at the level of sex? And it's also a question that the neurotic poses at the level of being. So Hamlet is the neurotic who poses the question to be or not to be. But these questions are meant to answer the question of subjectivity. You know, who am I? What am I? How do I structure my desire? And I think clearly in our contemporary times, at least for the last 400 years, race has been a way of structuring identity in the same way that sex and being structure identity. So that's the connection between race and subjectivity. It's not that race is inherent to subjectivity. Race is an external component of the subject, but it yet still structures the subject.
And sort of following on from that, we have a question from Chris that says, thank you very much. I have a question. To what extent can we understand race and the structure of identity in terms of capitalism and the current move to self-improvement that dominates disciplines such as psychology?
Sheldon, do you want that one?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that one.
I've heard you answer a version of that question before, like in a really, not to, you know, put too much pressure on you, but I've heard you do a really great answer to a similar question.
I can give an answer to that question. I'm not sure about the self-improvement component, but I think the relationship between race and capitalism, as I said, goes back at least 400 years. You know, there's a moment in Lacan's, in his seminar titled The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, in which Lacan talks about the birth of capitalism, and he pins it to a moment, a specific historical moment that involves what he calls the trafficking of ships. So he talks about these ships that are bringing goods. You know, they're traveling across Genoa, and you know, he says this is the birth of capitalism. But of course, the trafficking of ships is also the birth of slavery. So the slave trade, you know, comes out of this trafficking of goods, where embodied persons were the goods being trafficked, and they were being transformed into commodity. So capitalism and racism, they move in parallel with each other. And specifically in the American context, what you have is slavery, the trafficking of slaves, becomes a way of enjoying. What Lacan sees in the birth of capitalism is the development of a mode of calculating jouissance. He says that jouissance, or pleasure, becomes calculable through this trafficking of ships, through capitalism. We can measure how much we enjoy because we have X amount of goods in our possession. And the slave becomes part of those possessions. And so owning a slave indicates that you enjoy. It indicates your relationship to enjoyment, and it disavows your lack. It suggests that you are more human, you are superior, you are a member of a superior race. So they're closely ensnared with each other.
There's an interesting argument that develops a little bit some of what Sheldon was saying. So Michelle Stevens's chapter deals a lot with embodiment. And I think, just to try and keep it fairly straightforward, just in terms of what Sheldon was saying, this is an argument you can find in other facets of psychoanalysis, not all Lacanian psychoanalytic social theory, not just Lacan. But I think what one finds, particularly in the history of slavery and elsewhere, also in apartheid South Africa, is it seems that the implicit move, both explicitly ideological in some respects, but also psychical and in terms of fantasy, is that the way that white subjectivity has in some respects attempted to transcend its corporeal physicality, again, even if only at a fantasy level, is to delegate bodies and the bodiliness and the thingness, the physicality of existence to what is constructed and engendered as another race. And you find this in Fanon, but you find it in various other places as well. And it's a very powerful theme. And it's one way of thinking a little bit about slavery and the fact that slavery lasts for 250 years in the United States. So yeah, you want to take into account the capitalism, all of that stuff, but you could also say that one of the things that holds racism in place in its multiple different historical forms is that it is particularly for whiteness, it holds that promise of a transcendence of the nearly thing-likeness, bodiliness of one's subjectivity. So that gets delegated to others who suffer, who are subject to pain, for whom pain is an appropriate preoccupation. Whereas whiteness somehow needs to be accrue wealth, accrue culture, be associated with a whole series of values of transcendence.
Just in conjunction with what Derek is saying here, one of the things that my chapter engages is the history of minstrelsy, which is about this transformation, this embodiment of Blackness by white performers. But also the very final piece in this collection is an afterword that's written by Kalpana Seshaudry. And one thing we wanted to do in writing the book was pay homage to those authors who had come before and focus on these types of topics. So Kalpana closes off the book with an afterword that makes the argument that there is, quote, only one race, and that race is white. So her argument is that at the center of the concept of race is whiteness. Whiteness represents pure humanness. And her argument is that race, the concept of race, delegating race to someone else, is not only, as Derek was suggesting, it is on the one hand, getting past embodiment, but on the other hand, it is a rejection, according to Kalpana, of our inherent animal status. So it's a complete escape of the body, and it's a complete escape of um, of our existential condition. Whiteness is pure fantasy.